Hello, I am Addison, and this is Cannabis Clip Notes with Angie Roullier. Angie is an educator and an advocate, and most importantly, an author. Her first book, Pot for the People, The Plant, the People, and Shop Policies of Cannabis, sorts through the history and science of cannabis. And this is based on research and Angie's 12 years of personal interactions and conversations with medical marijuana patients, with cannabis consumers, working with the vendors and shop owners, and then seeking out scientists to improve her knowledge and confirm that what she's talking about is fact and not fiction. She's a firm believer that targeted, tailored cannabis and terpene medicine is the future of the industry. Now, in the first 10 years of Angie's 15-year cannabis journey, she had the opportunity to work as a Budtender, move into management, move into administration, and to work with patient and consumer relationships and patient and consumer education. She brings her knowledge and insights to the pages of her latest book, Budtender's Blueprint, Compassion and Chemistry at the Cannabis Counter. It is scheduled for pre-sale this fall 2025. So Angie, in your first book, Pot for the People, you talk about why shop policies matter. So why do shop policies matter? Are we talking SOPs? Are we talking compliance? What are shop policies?
Well, to me, shop policies pretty much is your SOP. It's the way that you run your circus day in and day out. When it comes to being compliant, based on whatever your state laws are, there's really not much you can do about it. You have to adhere by them. But when it comes to how you deal with your employees and how you interact with your consumers, these can really make a huge difference. Not everything's got to be clinical, not everything's got to be lame. Because the manner in which you set these policies is definitely going to influence your customer and your employee base. Customers, they recognize thoughtful attention. I have spoken before about notes in the POS system. If you can greet somebody based upon their name, fantastic. People really tune into that. They can really relate to having that kind of attention put onto them. I was always a big fan of making patient notes mandatory. Except if Steve has been in 6 times that day, maybe there's nothing left to say about Steve. But for the most part, you really want to take detailed notes so you can help them to the best of their ability. And not only that, but you aren't going to be the Budtender that gets Steve every single time. There are going to be other Budtenders. I've also been a big fan of making it mandatory that you have to read these notes before interacting with the patient. So, you get your iPad and, it shows that, oh, yep, Steve's up next, he's mine. Go through real quick on those notes and just get a gist of what's going on. Is Steve having trouble sleeping? Or has Steve tried to return, a half-smoked pre-roll 3 times last week? All of these things are going to make a difference in your consultation prior to walking up to them and, getting that conversation started. There's always going to be product complaints. The way that you deal with these and the way that the policy is set and how you deal with these can make the biggest difference too on whether you lose that customer or not and how you handle them. The Budtender's Blueprint, I do list canned responses just because it's easy to get defensive. When somebody is, coming at you, saying this, that, and the other thing, or this is wrong, or this sucks. So you really got to keep a cool head. And if you have these canned responses, at the ready, it's easy for you to diffuse the situation and try and figure it out, to where you're not breaking policy, but you're also making the customer happy. I'm a big fan of having a checklist of new to cannabis consumers. please don't put this down on paper. The last thing somebody wants when they're new to cannabis is to walk into a pot shop and be handed a bunch of paperwork to fill out. Okay, again, I believe this is one of the reasons why here in Michigan, over 300,000 registered patients, and now we're under 50,000, is because they don't want to be on the list. They don't want that personal information out there. But your bud tenders, they should have that list up in their craw. You know that somebody is brand new to consuming, automatically, and compassionately, please, ask the questions, what are you looking for in cannabis? Do you take any drugs that have a grapefruit warning? Have you spoken with your doctor? I mean, all of these can be worked into a conversation that doesn't have to be, clinical, here, fill out this form. I have also heard a couple of posts this week how people want this to be the receptionist's responsibility. Not a big fan. Okay, first of all, it's not the receptionist's job. Second of all, these people are going to have follow-up questions, and again, that is the bud tender's job. If they are trained properly, it is not receptionist's job. I would also put out empty packaging. Especially if they're new to cannabis, they're probably not going to realize what a pain in the ass it really is to get into some of these cannabis products. So let them play with the empty packaging, whether it be the Mylar bags or, the concentrate, jars, just so they can get the gist of it before they go home, especially, for the older, or should I say seasoned, clientele. Another thing I'm not a real big fan of, but there seems to be more and more, is the cattle corral. So you'll walk into a pot shop, it's big, room, almost looks like an Apple store these days. Somebody with an iPad will come up, they'll take your order, and then they push you into this line. And it's almost, like a line like you're getting ready to go onto a carnival ride. It swings and it sways. Well, for, some of us, myself example, I walk with a cane. The standing for long periods of time is not great. Okay, it sucks. And then here you're stuck in the middle of this line, you're looking around, there's absolutely nowhere to sit, there's nothing to hold on to if you do lose your balance. A couple of the shops I've worked at, we've always had one of those really high stools with the wheels. And just so people can kind of lean back on it, and then as the line moves, they can kind of, shuffle through the line, with their chair. As opposed to bringing them, a folding chair to which they have to get up and move every 5 feet every time the line moves, and that's just not real great. That doesn't make anybody feel good about what's going on. So these are some of the things that you can tweak your policy to be more compassionate for the people, that are coming into your shop and asking for help. An unpopular opinion that I have is I believe there should be a very large sign inside every pot shop that states cannabis may have drug interactions, especially with those drugs that come with a grapefruit warning. Again, I don't believe this belongs in the front window. I don't believe it belongs in the lobby. I believe it belongs in the bud tending room or in the bud room. So bud tenders can, help work through these questions that, the consumer may have when it comes to drug interactions. I think it's the responsible thing to do. And, everybody, this should be common knowledge for people, and it really isn't. You also have to worry about bullies. And bullying, again, is a huge problem in the cannabis industry, whether it be your bosses or whether it be the consumers. And, how you deal with them all comes down to policy, at least when it comes to the consumer. So let's say everybody knows, it's in his patient's notes, this guy's a jerk. And there's just no pleasing him, every single time. And then, one day he goes over the line, and, he actually starts to scream, at your bud tender. At this point, management should be, right up against that counter. But it comes down to policy of, when can that bud tender stop the consultation and go and grab management if management's not aware of the situation? And, what can management do about it? I have banned several people throughout my career just because I won't have my staff being treated poorly. I will not have it. There's absolutely no reason for it. We were only there to help, not to harm, and won't be treated that way. So I had an employee, for example, and this guy just kept tearing her to pieces about her age. I think she may have been early 20s at the time. And then finally he had called her stupid for being her age. I caught wind of it, went up, took that basket right off the counter, shoved it underneath, told the guy he was done. of course, spoiled brat starts, ranting and raving and, slamming doors as he leaves. More times than not, they usually come back once they find out that they've been banned, and he has to speak to management. So I explained to him, we absolutely won't tolerate it. And if he came back in to, cause more of a ruckus, I had no problem calling the cops. And he, of course, was all apologetic and, it will never happen again. And, please let me continue to come back here. I really like this place. And I said, well, you know what? I said, the Budtender that, you verbally beat up last time is here. I said, I'll send her out. If she feels the need to forgive you, I'll lift the ban. I said, and if she doesn't, then I won't. I said, I'm going to leave it up to her. She was the one who took the abuse. So that's exactly what I did. I sent Penny out there, and she got to, hear the guy's, speech and his apology, and she had decided to lift the ban. Under policy, though, the ban was there. It was lifted, but it was dated when it, when it went into effect and when it was lifted and why it was lifted and how it was handled. So now, a month later, when this guy decides to start spouting off again, the ban is banned. It is never going to change. And so these are some of the things, that your policy can, reinforce the security that your budtenders can feel, and, let other consumers know that it's not okay. You can't treat people this way. So policy is, it's more than, compliance with the law and, your SOPs and, how you're, supposed to weigh out your ounces and, things of that nature. To me, it's about how you interact with the consumer and, how, you work with your staff and to make it the best experience for everybody, regardless of what side of the counter that they're on. So I want to thank Addison and the Women's Cannabis Chamber of Commerce for the opportunity to share with you my experiences on writing a cannabis book and my very strong opinions on how I feel we can do better behind the cannabis counter.
So Angie's entire series of cannabis clip notes is available on the Women's Cannabis Chamber of Commerce website and